Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the May edition of the Divorce Support Club. The Divorce Support Club is a fantastic resource offered by Walker Family Law as an additional service to their legal services. It's a safe, informal place for you to come ask any questions that you might have and to gather a toolkit to help you manage your emotions, perhaps get clarity around the way that you want to move forward and focus on what you can do. We discuss strategies to help you take back your power, challenge any negative thinking that you might have, and focus on taking really positive steps forward. My name's Claire Macklin. I am a breakup and divorce coach. I'm a qualified coach. I've been through divorce twice myself. I'm a single parent to two boys who are no longer both in their teens. One's now in his 20s. I've been a second wife. I've been a stepmom. So I've got lots of experience to bring to the table. And I'm also the author of the book behind me, Breakup from Crisis to Confidence. My role is to support my clients through the emotional ups and downs of any breakup with confidence and with dignity so that you can look back and feel proud of how you behaved. And today I am delighted to say I'm joined by Lauren Preedy from Walker Family Law. Lauren, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you very much, Claire. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Lauren Preedy. I'm a solicitor at Walker Family Law, and I've been qualified um next year 20 years.
Wow,
I've been specialising in divorce and separation and financial resolution basically since I qualified. I've also been divorced and I'm currently I remarried a year ago and am the proud stepmom of an 11-year-old and a 9-year-old.
brilliant. Thank you very much, Lauren. So as you can tell, Lauren brings loads of professional and personal experience to this as well. Before I go on, if you're watching live, then we have enabled the chat feature. So if you'd like to ask a question, you can ask a question in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen or the chat box, and I'll keep an eye on those. We'll answer any questions towards the end of the session. So today we are going to talk about anger and managing your anger so that it doesn't derail your divorce. Um, so Lauren and I, when we were talking about this, were thinking about some of the timeline kind of triggers that there are for anger to really raise its head during the separation or divorce process. And there are so many, aren't there, Lauren? I mean, you must see it all the time as well. Those kind of timeline triggers,
Yes.
the initial ones, and then on going through the process.
Yes, there is, and sometimes they come at a time that's unexpected to a particular client, or something happens that's slightly not expected that can trigger it, or it might be something historical that's still an ongoing problem that can trigger it. So yeah, for everybody's different, everyone has different circumstances. But we're going to talk today, aren't we, about how to be mindful of yourself and how to cope with it.
Yes, exactly that. So, it's interesting what you say just now. There are things come up unexpected. A divorce or a separation is always going to throw curveballs across your path. And really, it's about how you react to those things and how you respond to them that can make the difference between a divorce that is very emotionally charged, very acrimonious, and one that is much more, I don't want to say amicable necessarily, but civilized, perhaps, and dignified.
And of course, even the most amicable of cases have moments where anger can happen from anybody.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we're talking here about situations that might arise from the initial split. Perhaps there's been betrayal, and perhaps it's the behavior of the other person that is riling you, or maybe there's the introduction and perhaps of a new partner, or the new partner meeting the children, or the new partner having a big influence on your ex-partner, so you see their behavior change, maybe right through to even beyond divorce. Sometimes these things can, anger can really come up when perhaps your ex moves in with somebody else or tells you that, and like what happened in my case when like 10 months after we separated, my husband came and told me he was expecting a baby with his new partner. Massive surges of emotion that you get at those points in time. The first point that I really wanted to make in this is something that I say to my clients a lot, which is that anger is really a normal part of going through a separation. And I'm just going to share a visual here to help with this because there is, in the late 60s, the psychologist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross did a lot of research into people who were going through grief. She was looking at people who were dying, but since then, it's been really very commonly accepted that this applies to any kind of change, really, any kind of transition, and it certainly applies to divorce. And anger is one of the stages on this process through this emotional journey. You might start with denial, this isn't happening. Whether that happens to you before you make a decision about separating, or whether it's, the separation has come as a surprise to you. One of the next stages is often anger, and anger comes with a really high level of energy, which can be sometimes a damaging thing because it can lead you to do things perhaps you may not think through the consequences and so on. There are all these different stages on the way through this journey, and it's never a simple one. It's up and down, it's a roller coaster. So you might find that you perhaps feel really angry 1 minute, and then 5 minutes later, you feel really, really sad, or you might swirl between accepting one day and feeling really angry the next. And I just want to reassure anybody listening that this is really normal. These are absolutely normal human reactions to something happening that you aren't necessarily always in control of. Um, one of one of the other things I wanted to touch on as well was the sort of fight, flight, freeze response. So often anger is a response to something else underneath it. It's a bit like an iceberg and it covers up loads of other feelings. So another really helpful visual here is this one. So anger is like the behavior that you see on the surface. Underneath that, your emotional brain is feeling all kinds of other things. Perhaps you're feeling anxious or afraid or disappointed or overwhelmed, or humiliated or shamed or any of these things. So those feelings then trigger a behavior. So I would really encourage anybody listening to start to try and identify when you're feeling angry, start to try and identify what feelings perhaps are below that iceberg of anger that's actually showing on the surface.
And
Because when you
sometimes
have
it
those,
can,
go on,
oh, oh, sorry,
sorry,
Claire. I was going to say sometimes it can be difficult to pick out
Mm,
where it has come from, can't it? So
yeah,
there might be a mixture of these things, and it's as when you and I have been talking about these things, sometimes when you feel an emotion,
mm,
um, it's lots of things adding to that emotion, so it can be difficult to know exactly which one has caused
yeah.
it.
And of course, it may not just be one of them. So, it may be that the situation that you're in is bringing up a whole host of different emotions that feel really overwhelming and that feel really difficult to handle and that feel um, really like they're taking over your every waking thought. Um, and when you're in that place of those feelings really rushing in and taking over, it kind of hijacks your logical brain. And so you go into this fight, flight, freeze response. So you might shut down, you might run away from the problem, or you meet it head on in fight
Mm.
mode. And that's possibly when a lot of anger perhaps comes out. And I know when we were talking, you were talking about the Inside Out character from
Yes,
the movie.
yes.
Yeah. You want to tell us a little bit more about what you noticed there?
Yeah, I think that for those of people that don't know, there's a Disney film, animated film called Inside Out, where there's different emotions inside the little girl's head. And it's quite thought-provoking, and to see that anger bursts out every now and again, and in my own experiences and my experiences of dealing with clients, sometimes that can happen, and then the other emotions in the little girl's brain then try to help calm anger down. So
Yeah, it doesn't always work, of course.
no, no. So I think we're coming on to talk about, Claire, aren't we? Kind of
Mm,
tactics for not reacting, or if you feel angry, what you
Mm.
can then do to stop it bursting out that
Yeah.
could perhaps then um, either cause you to feel even more angry or regretful of saying something you wished you hadn't, even if it is the other person's fault, if I can put fault in inverted commas,
Mm.
um, and how best to manage yourself and the situation.
Absolutely. And I think before we touch on that, it's probably worth looking at exactly how in the divorce process, how anger really can derail things, and can cost you hugely in both emotionally and also financially, through the process. So when you feel that anger, and you have that huge burst of energy because it brings that energy with it, you might do things that are perhaps a little bit out of character for you. You
Mm.
might do things that are out of character without thinking about the consequences of what that might look like further down the line. And of course, it might also increase conflict. If you and your ex-partner are very stuck in kind of angry backwards and forwards with each other, it just increases the conflict and increases the feelings that are rushing around and increases the cost. Unfortunately, I'm sure you've seen that lots of times, Lauren.
Yes, it can be really difficult to deal with as a solicitor as well, because I'm here to try to do my very best to support clients through the process. And although solicitors have training in dealing with conflict, and we have training in dealing with different personalities, and if there may be other things um, at play to do with narcissistic behavior or things like that, but I'm not a trained therapist. So sometimes when things like this come up, there may be other professionals that are needed to be involved, because I have to be conscious of costs, because that's a
Mm,
really important thing. And the last thing that we want to do is add to stress by a cost situation. So I often think of it as being the head against the heart. So sometimes my job is to make sure that whatever decisions are being made, that the head is being used rather than the heart, because the heart holds that anger and emotion. And the old saying, there's no point throwing good money after bad. Because actually, if you're arguing about something because you're angry, then in actual fact, that might not be, it could end up costing you a lot of money in legal fees to actually not achieve anything. So,
mm.
what I'm always doing throughout the divorce and the financial resolution aspect is making risk analyses. Is that risk analysis? Is that right? I'm saying that word a bit funny, aren't I? I'm
Risk
making an
analyses.
analysis of risk. Yes.
Yes.
Um, to make sure that um, what legal costs are being spent and what is that going to achieve. So,
Yes.
but
Yeah.
part of that,
Angry people can sort of uh, can pursue something that is going to be in the long term really financially damaging sometimes, can't they?
and the other, and flipping it to the other side as well, is that if the other person is very angry and they're sending letters to us to do with the case, which is the kind of the gist of that is based on anger rather than resolution, then I want to try to make sure that I can try to control that process and alleviate that anger to do the best we can to get it back on as amicable negotiations as possible, because that isn't going to help my client then. So it comes on from both sides, I suppose.
Yes, absolutely. And um, it then has impact on all the relationships for the person and those related people around them. You know, the children, for example.
Yeah.
Um, when children are caught up in really angry conflict, it can be really damaging to them. One of the other things that I've seen sometimes is sort of venting your anger, perhaps on social media, for example. And I just wondered if you could touch a little bit on that and sort of the dangers of venting that anger on social media, which is very public. If you're going through a divorce or involved, particularly in a court case, for example.
Yes. I mean, social media. obviously has its benefits in many ways. It can also have benefits when couples are separating because they can get to see photographs of the children doing things with the other person, but it can be massively um, triggering for one person or both if they're
Mm,
seeing things that they've not been told about, um, often in the context of things to do with children.
yeah.
So, for instance, if you've got a situation where a new partner has been introduced to a child, but the other parent hasn't been told about that, and then they see a photo of it on social media, of course, that's really upsetting. And the better way of dealing with that would have been for there to have been a private conversation or for it to be through the solicitors, depending upon the level of issues there are if it is a children case.
Mm,
But also things come up that can be really misunderstood. So if, for instance, there's a dispute about the amount of money available and there's photos of somebody on holiday, then of course that can cause difficulties as well. There might be another side to the story, of course. Somebody else, a parent, might have gifted a trip. But
mm.
again, that is a can be a trigger for anger.
Yes.
Things can be misconstrued, or comments can also be made by other people on the posts,
Absolutely,
which,
and that can lead to all kinds of snowballing, can't it? The snowballing effect of other people sort of jumping in on or either a post like that, or alternatively, the other thing that I've seen is where somebody will on Facebook or Instagram or wherever talk about their anger and sort of splurge their anger into that space. And of course, that might get you all sorts of really lovely responses from your friends and very supportive things, but actually, in the long run, all it does is keep you down that hole for longer. Um,
yeah, and there can also be, and again, depending upon what type of issues there may be between a separating couple, if there are issues that do involve any kind of domestic abuse or any kind of coercive behavior,
mm,
um, then it can be difficult then um, in other proceedings that may be going on. So
yes,
there can be things that could be, I say, for want of a better way of describing it, used against you in other
yes.
proceedings. You could be putting your foot in it, not realizing you are, or making something about your case more difficult for yourself.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah, I think the big piece of advice that I have around this is to avoid venting on social media,
mm,
avoid talking about it hugely on social media, keep things very private, so that you don't risk any of these things. And I always say to my clients as well, don't don't have your ex-partner anymore as your friend on any of these any
no,
of these
no,
sites. Instead, perhaps agree with each other that you'll send photographs across so you're not going in to look at their Facebook profile or their Instagram page or whatever it is, because that's like torture
yeah,
by social media for many people.
yeah. And the other thing as well is that whilst at the time people are going through a separation, they may have children that are too young to be on social media, or there might be blocks in place and all the necessary parental controls. That doesn't mean to say that things aren't preserved forever. And you
Yeah.
may be saying something that you're now minor children look at in 10 years' time when they're adults, and it kind of can come back to haunt you almost. So this is me now talking from a kind of thinking about the effects on emotionally as opposed to a legal impact. But I think it's important to bear in mind, and I can understand from lots of my clients when something's posted on there and I don't blame them for wanting to respond to it. And but that's one of the that we'll come on to talk about those tactics, won't we, Claire? So,
Yes, absolutely. One of those tactics that I remember talking about with a friend is to say to yourself, be still that texting finger.
oh,
At that point in time, just stop the itch. Don't do it. Go and do something else instead, because it rarely leads to anything good.
mm,
So yes, that leads us nicely into sort of strategies to suggest that to help people perhaps manage that anger. Now, not every strategy we're going to suggest will work for everybody, but we have got lots of strategies that we talk about often with clients. And I think the first thing always to do is to be really aware. So check in with yourself about what you're feeling. Name the emotions that might be underneath it as well, because they will be telling you something about what perhaps you need, or they might be telling you something about what your triggers are. And I would also then start to put those feelings on a scale of 1 to 10. So 10 being I am more livid than I've ever been in my entire life, down to sort of one being I feel a slight irritation, perhaps. So start to kind of rate those feelings on a kind of sliding scale. And if you keep a diary of those feelings over time, you'll start to notice how they are shifting, how they perhaps are waning, the sorts of things that lead you to feel those very strong feelings, so that you can work out what the big triggers are for you if you're not really sure. And then you can start thinking about your responses in advance. Um, Now, the second thing I always think is once you're aware that you're feeling this big emotion that's rising up, the first thing to do is to breathe and to take a few moments just to breathe in and out. And I practice box breathing quite a lot with my clients. And box breathing is when you breathe in and you count to four, and then you hold for four, and then you breathe out and count to four, and then you hold breath again and count to four. If you do that 4 or 5 times, it brings oxygen into your bloodstream, takes oxygen to your brain. It helps to soothe that initial fight, flight, freeze response. I can even actually tell my own voice, just talking about it, has slowed my voice down, and sort of calmed my heart rate down. So that's really helpful. Stop, breathe, and then you'll find that you're much more able to think, as a result. And then there are other sort of practical ways in which you can start to get that anger out. Because if you keep that anger all inside, and it develops into like a big knot inside you, or like some of my clients will describe it as kind of a heavy weight sitting on their chest, or a churning feeling in their stomach, or a red ball of fire inside their heart or whatever. Um, if it stays there, it can start to cause all kinds of physical manifestations. So you might start having headaches, or feeling really tired, or very high levels of stress or frustration. Your stomach might perhaps respond, or you might break out in eczema and you haven't had it for the last 10 years. It can have these really physical side effects. So getting it out and getting it out safely is really important. So for some people, that might be journaling. For some people, that might be writing a letter to your ex-partner that you never sent. For other people, it might be going off and having a real stomp through the woods, going for a run. I remember I had a client once who told me that she ran for miles and miles and miles just to get that anger out of her system. You might want to write down the things you're angry about on pebbles and throw them in the sea. And of course, there's also the option, of course, to work through those feelings perhaps with therapists as well. So that's the first thing. Recognize it, scale it, breathe, and then find some safe ways to let it out. Don't keep it in. And then one of the other things that I talk about a lot with clients is looking at what you can control. Because often anger arises when you're trying to control or influence something that you just have no control over. So, you only have control over yourself. You can't make your ex-partner different. You can't necessarily make the situation different. You can't make their behavior different. You can't stop them from doing certain things. What you can do is shift from being frustrated with them to looking at what you can do differently to respond. And I don't know if you see that as well. I imagine in your practice too, sort of shifting from reacting to responding has a real impact.
Mhm. Yeah, it does. And I think that it's well, one of the probably to link in with that might be a good way of describing it as well. In some of the parenting apps, if you type something that the app recognizes as being aggressive or swearing or something like that, then it kind of gives you a notification that you are.
Yeah, tonometer, I
Um,
think they call it, don't they?
yes, yeah. And again, even I mean, I try to practice on the basis that I don't write antagonistic letters to other solicitors, and the code of practice for resolution which is the body of family lawyers, is that you write and you deal with everybody with dignity and respect and to try to resolve things. So I think, but that doesn't always happen, and some practitioners do send letters that are massively triggering for people. And I then have clients say, I want you to reply to that. And in that precise moment, I probably also want to reply to that. But having taken deep breaths, me and the client, you can sit and think, well, actually, they have not achieved anything by what they've said. It's wasted their own client's money and time. They've probably wound themselves up. And actually, no, I'm not going to respond to that. I'm going to respond to the factual part of the question that's been raised because that is what is going to progress the case amicably.
Mm.
So,
Yeah,
uh,
really, really good advice. And I think that people listening can take that advice on board in
mm,
terms of their own correspondence too. I remember working with a
yeah,
client once who was really angry with his ex-wife, and he was firing off all sorts of messages in response to her angry messages in. And we spent a whole session looking at the kind of boundaries he wanted for himself. So his internal boundaries about how he responded to messages from her.
mm,
Um,
yeah,
and he created a sort of 5 point list of I want to be polite, civil, firm, but fair. And so we created a whole list of things that he wanted to be and things that he didn't want to do. And then every time he got a message in, he would go to those guidelines and use them to craft his response,
yeah.
which toned things down hugely. So just some really quick tips about, responding when you're angry, because it's never a good idea to respond in the heat of the moment in these situations. And this is something I used for myself. I made myself stick to what I called the 24-hour rule. So if anything came in from my ex-husband that made me feel really angry or threatened or fearful, I would sit on it for 24 hours. I'd read it through and then I'd put it to the side and was park it in my head and I would try and sleep on it. Because often when you wake up in the morning, even the very message that they've sent might look different. And then you can go through, I used to print them out and then I'd go through it and I would put a line through everything that didn't need a response. So anything that was a personal attack on me, black line. Um, Anything that wasn't asking for something specific, black line. And then I would highlight the questions that were actually being asked. And I would
Yeah.
only reply to those bits. So sleeping on it and the 24-hour rule, and having your own boundaries really strong in place for when you're communicating is really good starting point for that.
And the other thing I think that's probably also worth mentioning is and we all know, but if any alcohol has been consumed, then sending messages is definitely not a good idea because we've all been there when you might have had a message when you've had a glass of wine and you feel more free to type how you might feel, but again, to resist doing that.
Yes, yeah, I remember working with another client who used to do exactly that on a Friday evening. She would look back at all the messages in the week and fire off a really angry response to all of them after sort of 2 or 3 glasses of wine on a Friday evening. And it never went anywhere productive. And it increased their costs massively.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, always leave it 24 hours, always sleep on it if you can. Sometimes there are things that come in urgently, but only then, even then, only respond to the bit that really needs a response. And if you need to, also go and take advice before you fire off a response to something
Yeah.
that frightens
Yeah.
you. Perhaps it's something about um, sharing care for your children, and it triggers a really deep response in terms of, perhaps it's about timings of when the children are, maybe right at the early stages, and it's really scary to think that you might not be able to see your children for certain amounts of time. Take advice before you fire off really angry responses.
And I think the other thing as well is that um anger uh, well has it's not a comfortable emotion. Is that the best way of describing
Yes.
it? But that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So you don't have to pretend that you're not angry because I think
Mm,
some people worry that they can't express that they are. but it's
Yeah.
perfectly normal to feel angry in many of these situations. So to not be afraid to share that.
Yes. So actually, that's just made me think about this. If you receive an email in that has made you feel really angry, you could potentially write a response back saying, I've received your email. I feel really angry about it at the moment, so I'm going to take a break. I'll come back to you in a couple of days.
Yeah.
Take the space. Um, Another really good one is to sometimes in some situations is to ask questions rather than going back with a really angry response. So I like the sort of be curious, not furious
Oh,
kind of
yes.
mantra.
Yes.
Yeah, so go back with questions to try and understand because sometimes we make assumptions about someone else's intentions. So we might assume that the other person is deliberately saying whatever it is to hurt us or to punish us, or deliberately to make things difficult. But it might actually be something completely different. So in some circumstances, you could go back and say, I saw you said this, and I really want to understand more about that. Can you tell me more about it, please?
And I suppose the
Because
other
you
thing
might
is,
learn something different.
yeah, the other thing as well, of course, is there's a difference between writing a letter and then writing a text message. And of course, people are very colloquial or might use slang in a text message.
Yeah.
So they might be communicating something that uses a word that actually is a slang word, and they don't mean it to come across as it sounds. Um, which
Yes.
again, by not reacting to it, may make you realize that.
Yes. And I talk about discretionary engagement with my clients. Anything that comes in from the other person or from their solicitor or your solicitor, you have discretionary engagement. So you can choose when you read it, first of all, so you can choose when you open that email that comes in. And I often ask say to my clients, set up a separate folder, put a rule that all emails from this person go to that folder so that you can open that folder as and when you're ready to do so. Don't ignore it altogether, of course. You can choose when you read their what they send. You can choose how you respond to it. You can choose whether you respond to it in some cases, and you can choose which bits of it you respond to as well.
Yeah.
So I find that's a really helpful thing to think about too.
And that's another good thing about the parenting apps. I say parenting apps, I'm putting that in the context of if there's disputes with children, but any kind of app that takes messages out of your normal everyday um life, if I can put it like that, or if something has come into even I say to clients, if emails, of course, have come in from me, they may want to archive them. So they're not in their emails every time they go in to see them. um, because you don't have to deal with these things all the time. You have to put your own boundaries in place to deal with correspondence. As I said, even if it's sent from me, I
Mm,
do always try. One of the things I do always make an really try hard to do is that if I know there's some if a communication comes in that I have to share because most of the time, 99% of the time that has to happen. And I know that it's going to trigger something with my client, or I know they're going to be upset or angry, then I won't just send it. I'll either ring or I can't speak to them, I'll send an email to say I need to send you something. I just want to check that you're happy for me to send it now. I wouldn't send anything at 5 o'clock if I'm not working the next day or anything like that because
yes,
um I want to try to manage helping that person as best I can.
absolutely. And that's a really important conversation, isn't it, to have early on in your relationship with, in your case, your client, and in anybody
Mm,
watching with your solicitor, to have that conversation with them so that they understand. I've been working with a client recently who found the solicitor's letters really, really difficult to open at all. So she would often call me, and I would just be on the phone while she was opening the correspondence up. And her solicitor, what they did to help her was that they would summarise the letter in the email so that when she opened the letter, it wasn't a huge shock what it contained. So they would summarize it in often
yeah.
kinder words than the original letter perhaps used. So there are all sorts of ways in which we can help you to handle some of these really hard hitting things that might lead to these really strong reactions. There was something else that we were thinking about as well in preparation for this, which is sometimes you have less capacity or more capacity to deal with things. So sometimes your anger might be amplified by something else perhaps that's happening in your life that's totally unrelated to your separation. And I remember this happening to me early days in my first divorce. My closest friend at the time um, had told me a couple of days before, whatever it was, my ex, I can't even remember what he sent me now. Um, she had told me a couple of days before this email arrived that really raised my hackles that she was moving away from Bristol and moving down right down to Cornwall. So I was unlikely to be able to see her as often as I was. And that had really upset me. But that meant that I had less capacity to receive any messages from my ex at that point in time and less capacity to deal with anything. So it's worth thinking about, what else is happening in my life and how is that impacting on how I'm responding here? It might be even as simple as, am I really tired? Am I really hungry? Am I worried about something else? That can really make a difference as well. Nothing that I often do in my sessions with clients is I'll get them to have a conversation with their anger. So we will actually invite the anger that might be inside their body, we will invite it out to sit on their hand and we sit there like this and we sort of envisage what that anger looks like. And I remember one client saying, oh, it's really heavy and it's really dark and it's shouting at me really loudly because it wants me to hear. And we'll have a conversation actually with the anger. If the anger could speak to you, what would it say? What does it need, perhaps? And that can be really, really interesting because sometimes anger arises because something that you value has been overstepped, or there's something that you need that you're not getting, and you might be able to get that from a different source, perhaps. Um, and then the one thing that really worked for me when I was going through my divorce around anger was the mantra that um, holding on to that anger is like drinking poison and expecting someone else to die. If I held on to my anger with my ex-husband, he didn't even know about it, especially if I was following all my own rules about 24 hours and sleeping on it and being civil and polite in my correspondence. That anger was just fizzling away inside of me, and he wasn't even aware of it. And I was carrying it around every day, and it was really heavy. So I decided that I didn't want to carry it around anymore because it was only me that it was damaging.
Mm.
So sometimes mantras like that can be really helpful too. Is there anything that you want to add to all of that, Lauren?
No, I don't think so. I think that it sometimes it depends on what experiences you may have had or what you know or what you may have thought about things like meditation and the breathing
Mm,
exercises. Some of these things are quite strange to people. And it's the whole thing about the mind and body being linked and
yeah.
our physical well-being and our emotional well-being.
Mm,
And that's why sometimes people are a bit skeptical about the kind of breathing exercises if it hasn't been something that you've ever experienced before. So I think I'd say give it a go.
yes,
Um,
absolutely. Yeah, I'm experiencing this actually at the moment in a totally unrelated context with a member of my family who's angry about something. And I was I was trying to help them to start to sort of shift their brain around. And one of the things that I asked them to do was to each evening before they go to bed, think back on the day and identify three things that went well today or three things that they're grateful for, because that can help to shift your mind as well. But people are often
mm,
a little bit resistant to doing something like that. So I would always say, try it. Try it for a week. If you don't like it or it doesn't work, you can stop doing it. You've not lost anything by giving it a go.
mm. It's the whole thing about they say, don't they, that like the crying over spilt milk, that if you spill milk when you're having your breakfast and you let that make you angry, you can carry it into your whole day.
Yes, absolutely. And that's a really good analogy because actually, if you carry your anger with you forward from here, you carry that anger into all your future relationships as well. And I've seen some really interesting research and statistics around when you carry the anger from this relationship into perhaps your next relationship, you're only 80% really there. And that anger is carried then forward and it flows out into that new relationship. And then if you do it again, even less of you is present. So actually it's really important for you to find ways to deal with that anger.
Yeah, there's lots of good literature um in relation to sports people
Mm,
and obviously controlling how the brain deals with anger if you've missed a shot, but then you've got to recover yourself.
mm,
Like the kind of psychology that comes from that, which I'm not comparing it directly with this, but it's just how our brain holds these things, and
mm.
it is hard. It's hard
Yeah.
to deal with some of these things, and like you say, some of the techniques take a lot of practice.
Mm. Yeah, they might
And
feel really strange and really weird and really
mm,
unnatural to you at first. But over time, you move from you move from finding it really difficult to do to it becoming much easier to do those things. You know, anything that you practice significantly over a period of time will become a habit
mm,
eventually. Eventually.
yeah,
So yeah, so I would absolutely say, try these things out. If you really, really don't like them, give it a week before you stop. Because you've lost nothing then.
and they don't cost anything.
No,
So,
no. Learning how to breathe differently, learning how to read. I call it goat tracks actually. So you're learning how to create different goat tracks in your mind about your thought processes. It doesn't cost anything, but the
mm,
benefits to you can be huge. So the goat tracks thing is like, the goat follows the same path to the same bush, the habitual thoughts that it has.
yeah,
And then one day you decide to have a different thought about it and you track a path to a different bush. Well, gradually the old path will get overgrown and the new path will become your new normal. So your brain is very plastic. And starting to think about things differently will change how you feel about them in the long run.
mm,
The other thing we wanted to very briefly touch on was how sometimes, of course, going through a divorce, the anger that you feel is absolutely justified, and you probably do need to do something. Um, you know, so that action really is warranted. Um, so I'm just trying to think of some examples. So, for example, your ex-partner is really unreliable and doesn't bring the children back, or there are all kinds of things where perhaps some of that anger is warranted and you do need to do something. And I'd always advise the first thing is to again do some of that breathing,
mm.
calm, but then think about what advice you might need, what help you might need.
Yeah, I can an example linked to children is that over the years I have dealt with lots of cases where situations have arisen where one person's not adequately supervising children
Yeah,
um for lots of different reasons, maybe not intentionally or intentionally in different cases. And awful things have happened, like somebody's been hurt because of that. So that is going to elicit an angry response that needs
yes,
action to ensure that the child is safe.
yes. Yeah, that's a really good example of the kind of thing I was thinking of. So in that case, again, do the breathing, get yourself a little bit calmer, pick up the phone, think about who you need to support you through that. On things like that, of course, keeping a record, keeping evidence, all of
Mm,
those things will come in really helpful.
yeah,
And then there might be things that legally you can do moving forward to add protection, but that's
yeah,
not the scope probably of what we're talking about today.
yeah. And sometimes there's things that happen that elicit anger, which are really difficult to legally do anything about. So I'll share an example as well. Um, my client had an event booked in London on one of the boats with the dinner and
Mm.
dance and things like that. Um, on the weekend where the other person was meant to look after the children, and they didn't turn up
Right.
to pick the children up, so they couldn't go.
Mm.
So not only was the disappointment of not going, but a lot of cost implication of not being able to go to a really important event for them.
Yes. Yeah. And of course, you might be in a situation where that may or may not have been deliberately
Mm,
done. So I think, one thing that I always say to my clients is, particularly if your ex-partner is unreliable, and I don't know if in that case this was a generally unreliable person or a kind of a one-off.
mm,
If you have a generally unreliable ex-partner, always, 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 as far as you can, have somebody who you can turn to on an occasion like that, whether that's a parent, a friend, another relative. Always have somebody in the background, because one of the things that's really important is to work out what you can control, and you can control your plan B. You can't
yeah.
necessarily control the other person who's plan A, but have a plan B in the background.
Mm.
Yeah, I hope that situation was resolved in a way that was productive, but but yeah. Um, so what else? Other ways to express that anger in a more productive way. Use it. I think anger can be a really useful compass for you. So thinking about what's underneath that anger and what's being threatened, and then asking yourself some really logical questions about what is it exactly that's being threatened here? What is it that I need in order to protect myself from that in the future? So using something that happens to you now to think of how you might protect yourself from that, or something similar again in the future, and kind of thinking ahead and being proactive in thinking ahead. I suppose one example of that is having your plan B if your
Yeah.
plan A is a very unreliable person. Yeah.
And that's
Um,
that causes frustration in all other kinds of different things, isn't it? So
yeah, yeah,
we've all just
yeah.
got to help our clients and our clients to just um be mindful of taking it a day at a time because there can be lots of difficult things and anger can also be you can be speculating about anger, can make yourself feel angry, thinking about something in the future which may or may not ever happen.
Yes, yes, absolutely. So just be really mindful about where your thoughts are going, because
Mm,
your thoughts spiraling off can really cause you to feel all kinds of things. It might be anger, it might be feeling depressed, or or something else. But just be really mindful of your thoughts spiraling off and bringing them back in. I talk about the what if tree quite a lot with my clients. So the what if tree is this tree that you plant and then you water it with your thoughts. So if you water it with lots of angry thoughts or spiraling thoughts that take you to a much darker place, you're going to grow a dark what if tree. What if the worst? However, you can water your tree with different thoughts of, what other options do I have? What other choices do I have here? And you water your what if tree with those thoughts, you're going to create a
mm.
different kind of tree.
Yeah, and we've talked you and I have talked about this before, Claire, that I really like these visual images of things because for
Mm,
me they really help me to yeah, they strike a note with me every time. So I really like that one that you've just described. And
mm,
but again, other people may like to listen to something. They might like to see something. So people can deal with their anger in different ways. And these techniques, and that's why it's important to be in touch with somebody like you, Claire, because you can help that person work out which techniques are the best for them, depending upon um the things which help them.
Yes, and the way that they think. So, you're a very, very visual thinker, but somebody else might be a very sort of logical thinker, for example.
Mm,
So different things will work for different people. So
yeah.
anyway, I hope that has given everybody listening some ideas around how they, strategies to sort of manage those very normal feelings of anger through this process. Um, and I hope that you find them useful and that you maybe try some out. Let us know how you get on if you'd like to. And of course, if you would like to have any further conversations with either Lauren or I, then please do get in touch. We will be back next month with next month's PSC in June. So until then, I'd just like to say thank you very much, Lauren, and thank you particularly for sharing some of your personal stories and stories from your experience as well. That's always really helpful.
Yeah,
So
my
thank
my
you very
pleasure.
much.
Thank you, Claire.